Welcome to the Prepped and Polished podcast, the podcast that empowers you to take control of your education, featuring weekly interviews with influencers in the world of education, as well as tutoring tips, lessons, and updates. And now, here's your host.
Hi everyone, welcome to another Tutoring Tips episode of the Prepped and Polished podcast. This is Aaron of Prepped and Polished. Please be sure to check out our website at www.preppedandpolished.com. For tutoring in person or online, please call us at 781-753-9951 or chat with us instantly on our website. You can also join our Prepped and Polished community on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Prepped and Polished. If you have a question after the show, please ask us a question on the chat feature on our website. We love hearing from you. Now let's get right into episode number 247, How to Excel on the ACT Math section. Today on our podcast, we're going to be talking about how to excel on the ACT Math section. Now, the ACT Math section is notorious for being a very big portion of the ACT section as a whole. It is the second part of 4. It is 60 minutes with 60 questions. The longest amount of time and the second longest amount of questions next to the ACT English section. Now, when we're thinking about the ACT Math section, there are obviously some parts that I will cover today that are what we call foundational elements to consider. However, there are other aspects of the test to think about in order to excel in it. First of which is time management. Now, I said at the very beginning, 60 questions, 60 minutes. If we were to evenly distribute our time, that is 1 minute per question. However, as every student who takes the ACT knows, some questions take a minute, some take less, and some take more. So understanding how to manage one's time when taking the ACT Math section is extremely critical. We work with students all the time on determining what is the best portioning of their time for each section of that math section. So whether or not it is taking the first 30 questions in 20 minutes, or the first 45 in 40, or maybe a student is just aiming for the highest score there is for the math section, 36, in which case they might have to finish the first 30 in 20 minutes, or the first 40 in 30, so that they have more time to answer the later questions. Time management becomes a very, very big part of this test. So starting off strong, we need to have that time management down. Now, another strategy, actually a 3-tier strategy that I use with students, is memorization, recognition, and application. Now, memorization deals with formulas, approaches, processes that students need to know before going into the test. Now, this could be anything from memorizing the quadratic equation, but also knowing how to solve systems of linear equations through either elimination or substitution. Having this base knowledge will allow a student to not look at a question and be like, I don't know what this question is about, or I don't remember what the formula is. So often students find this happening to themselves, and it's a very easy mistake or easy error to correct. However, the student does need to put in some work to make sure that they are able to answer those questions and able to recall those formulas. Second part of this is recognition. Now, this is, in my opinion, the hardest step, but it deals with question identification or topic identification and strategy identification. A lot of times when we read a problem, I will ask a student, what is this problem about? And if they're able to tell me the topic, that's a great step towards then acknowledging this is the topic and what strategy, what formula works best with this topic. Once a student is able to identify and recognize the topic, comes our last point, application. Now, this is where students apply their knowledge, formula, comprehensive information specific to the question, and answer the question. However, this is also where the easiest errors, in my opinion, can occur, such as calculation errors, misreading the questions, or misreading the answer choices for each question. This is a lot of times what befalls a lot of students in the beginning of the test, or sometimes at the end of the test when they're not sure what they just answered, or they think they answered something that was being asked, but in actuality, they were never asked that. Another point to think about on how to excel in the ACT Math section is to consider the question difficulty. The ACT Math section is the only section of the ACT where As you go from question 1 to question 60, the questions do get progressively more difficult. Now, my joke with students is that it's not exactly a linear progression, but there is an increase in difficulty. I have seen at times where there are certain milestones, we'll call them, question 20, 30, 40, and then in the 50s, where there are peaks of difficulty, such as logarithmic equations, trigonometric identities, or graphing of trig identities, and or long-run probability. So these types of questions, or these question points, might have a little bit more difficulty and then kind of dip down into difficulty of being less difficult. However, it is good for a student to be aware of what exactly is that increasing order of difficulty and how can I prepare for it. Another point to consider is what can a student expect in terms of those types of topics from questions 1 through 60. Now, when we get into the higher echelon of the ACT math section, aka questions 45 through 60, there's a little bit more variety and a few one-off questions that we could say show up. For example, matrices, as I mentioned before, logarithms possibly could show up, imaginary numbers could potentially show up. But what I'm going to be looking at is mainly questions starting from questions 1 to 45 and sometimes question 50. These question topics can include and are not limited to systems of equations, percentages, word problems, angles and their rules, triangles, including special right triangles and trig identities with triangles, area, volume, perimeter, shapes as a whole, probability, exponents, logarithms, basic trigonometry to graphing trigonometry, graphing as a whole, linear equations, quadratics, mean, median, mode, any kind of experimental data, and multi-step problems. Now, this is a laundry list of potential topics that can show up on the ACT math section. And when you're working with a tutor here at Prepped and Polished, we work at every one of these points so that a student is prepared for any kind of question about them. Certain questions, as I mentioned before, matrices or the questions that come up at the tail end of the test, we focus in on those. However, as I tell students, that really hard question, number 54, is worth the exact same amount as question number 2 at the beginning of the test. And if we're looking at one-to-one ratios, ironically, it doesn't matter if which question you get right. However, if you're taking more time to get question 54 right, and that costs you 2 questions earlier on, then that question is not worth it. So we spend a good amount of time on that base foundational knowledge in the beginning, dealing with algebra, geometry, what we call trigonometry and others in terms of content, so that students prepared for it. And when we get to that higher point, that pinnacle of the math section, then we delve into more particular topics, specifically matrices. If a student has never seen a matrix problem before, what are the component parts of it? How do we understand it? How do we add? How do we multiply? How do we subtract? What is the determinant? All those types of questions. However, when we're looking at the math section as a whole, we want to figure out basically what is the student's ability. If the student is aiming for a high tier score, we need to cover everything. However, every student needs to have a base foundational knowledge, and that's where a lot of students can excel, at least get a big bump in their scores. If we can get them the first 30 to 40 questions correct, they're going to be looking at a very nice score or starting point to then build from. That's going to be the important thing, is that a student has at least a solid foundation, a solid starting point to build from, and then keep going. As I mentioned, the best way to excel in the ACT math section is to be prepared. That means being ready for any kind of time management that is necessary for the test, being prepared for memorization of certain formulas, equations, approaches, processes, strategies, process of elimination, and then knowing kind of as a preview what kind of questions can show up, what is the difficulty, what is the content that can appear. If a student is able to hit all those points, they're going to do well in the ACT math section. And if you have a student who's looking to improve their score on the ACT math section, and this also goes for the SAT math section, please contact us at Prepped and Polished. We'd be happy to help support your student and try and help them attain a score that is best reflective of their abilities. This wraps up our show, episode number 247, How to Excel in the ACT Math section. Be on the lookout for our next podcast episode, number 248. Thanks for joining us on the Prepped and Polished podcast today. Now go out there and take control of your education.
You've been listening to the Prepped and Polished podcast. For more information, check out preppedandpolished.com. Also, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.